In this video, the first thing we're going to look at is question 6 of the Edexcel GCSE specimen paper. And we'll start that by looking at the introduction to the question and how I believe it can be improved. We're then going to look at analysis of the exam board answer and how they wrote the answer, before we then move on to look at analysis of the exemplar, so student exemplar, that received full marks. Before finally, we're going to see how can we take that student answer, because as you'll see, I believe that the student answer is actually a better answer than the exam board answer, but how can we constructively criticise that in order to assist our students with best practice in this particular question and how that references back to other topics. So in this part of the video, we're going to look at the question itself and the analysis. So this is question 6 of the Edexcel specimen paper. I apologise for the blurriness, but I'll read it out to you. So it's essentially a program to authenticate a login consisting of a login name and a passcode. Effectively, there is a list of users stored as a two-dimensional list. There's 19 of them in the list, and that list contains the user number, I would call that ID, last name, first name, login name and passcode. And the list is sorted by login name, and each of the users have a passcode that are integers between 1000 and 9999. This is a suggested time of 25 minutes with a total mark of 15. The question itself splits the question even into 3 separate parts, which you will recall is the standard input, process and output. So far, so good. And this is quite a difficult question, certainly one in a GCSE exam. The fact that it's 15 marks kind of explains that. So first of all, let's look at the input. So the first thing is to prompt for and accept a login name. No validation required. Well, to me, that's very straightforward. There's nothing more to explain there. The next 2 parts are bullet points, a little bit more complicated from my perspective, not in terms of the code, but what code is expected from the student. So it says prompt for and accept a 4-digit password code. You can assume only numbers will be entered, and then ensure the passcode is between 1000 and 9999 inclusive. So it doesn't use the word validation, but it seems to be implied that in terms of numbers, there will be no validation to check that they are actually numbers. But then it does say ensure the passcode is between 1000 and 9999. What does that mean? Because when I read this, I wasn't quite clear. And of course, any sensible person would read the whole question. And I'm going to look at the end first, where it says do not add any functionality, and not is in bold. So as a student in a stressful exam, perhaps I'm neurodivergent and I take things literally, what does ensure the passcode is between 1000 and 999 mean? Does it mean a simple if statement, i.e. we simply say if it's not between that, then end the program, otherwise carry on with the rest of it? Or does it require us to effectively don't allow the user to go any further forward until they have entered a correct passcode? And to me, that would give me stress. In fact, I struggle to identify which is the correct answer. So on that point, let's just have a look at how this was in fact thought about. So we're going to have a look at the student, and this is an exemplar where the student received full marks. And you'll notice that they chose the option of a while loop. So basically they said, I interpret this question as meaning that you must not allow the user to continue until they've entered a valid 4-digit passcode. A 66% marker, a partial marks exemplar, they in fact did exactly the same. Again, there is a logic error here. But the point of the matter is that this student stated, well, I believe that what that means is that you can't go any further until you've ensured that there is a valid passcode. However, let's move on to the actual code that is provided by Edexcel as their exam exemplar, and you'll notice that they don't do that. They use an if statement, and essentially they say if it's valid, continue, otherwise prevent this error message. And so to me, the fact that the students interpreted it one way, yet the exam board were believing that the exemplar should be done a different way, means that that question could have been written much more appropriately. So let's move on now to the process part. So work with any number of users in the list. Well, that's designed to make sure that the user uses some form of function like len. And in fact, if you look at the mark scheme, particularly it says the use of a library subprogram len to make sure that you work with any number in the list. I think that's a reasonably straightforward requirement. Use a linear search to find the record with the correct combination of login name and passcode. That seems to be sensible. Stop searching when the location of where the record should have been found is passed, for example, and it gives you an example. I think that's okay. But then it says does not need to loop continuously, and I think that that is somewhat ambiguous. I think it would be much better to change that third bullet point to say stop searching when you either reach the location of where the record should have been found or when you get to the end of the list, for example. Moving on to outputs, there are quite clearly, bearing in mind it says do not add any additional functionality, but it says display a welcome message including the user's first and last name if the login name and passcode are found, and then display an invalid input message if the login name and passcode are not found. So when I read that, I read a simple if statement. If user found with correct passcode, then print this message, else print a different message. So in terms of the outputs, there are two messages. Again, if one looks at the Edexcel exemplar, you can see that in fact there are 1, 2, 3 messages. And is that adding additional functionality or not? Should a student be worrying about having to do this? And we'll speak later about why this is actually very bad code. Going back to the task, of course it says do not add any other functionality. So one of the other things you'll find is, when we come to it, is that the Edexcel exemplar doesn't meet that requirement itself.